him by his side and gave him kind of trivial positions, so to speak, so they could be in the White House. They were part of the Kennedy inner circle, and he needed them in office. So he had a very, very good cabinet. He really did. And a very diverse cabinet and a strong cabinet during his presidency. Okay, that'll take us then to the formation of the Peace Corps. Formation of the Peace Corps. Some of you might have known this, I don't know. But on March 1st of 1961, not too long after he got into office, on March 1st, 1961, President Kennedy publicly announced the formation of the Peace Corps, which he set up as a temporary government agency. Okay? On March 1st of 1961, President Kennedy announced the formation of the Peace Corps, which was set up as a temporary government agency. He asked Congress to evaluate this temporary program, and if it was successful, then they were going to make it a permanent program. Well, it must have done pretty well, because it still exists today. It still exists today, the Peace Corps. But it was set up to be temporary, and Kennedy asked Congress to evaluate this temporary program, and if they believed it would be a successful program, to make it permanent. Well, there are two things the Peace Corps did concerning developing nations. Two things the Peace Corps did in 1961 concerning developing nations. What are developing nations, first of all? Third world countries, not totally up to snuff, so to speak, with the modern ways of today. And the two things that they provided developing nations were humanitarian aid and education. Humanitarian aid and education. Now, he had to choose somebody to organize this. You know who he chose? Sergeant Shriver. You know who Sergeant Shriver was?
He's over there.
He's actually over here.
Ah.
He's right here. He's in this section here, which is what? The Kennedy family. He was married to John Kennedy's sister, Eunice. Okay? And he chose his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, to organize and oversee the Peace Corps. Eunice Shriver, you know what she developed in this country? Special Olympics. Yeah, Special Olympics. Sergeant Shriver was her husband, and Kennedy chose him to organize and oversee the Peace Corps. Sergeant Shriver, good man. Anybody know how the Peace Corps started, or you know how it even is today? What's the Peace Corps consist of? Well, but what is it? You're gonna provide humanitarian aid and education to developing countries, third world countries. Who's going to do that? Volunteers. Very good. So at this time in history, the Peace Corps would enlist volunteers. You mostly were youths out of college. They were young people, and they were basically paid a living wage. Not a lot of money. They were volunteer, but they did pay them enough to be able to live, okay, in these foreign countries. So the Peace Corps would enlist volunteers. At this point in history, they were mostly youths out of college who were paid a living wage, and they would travel to these less advantaged countries to educate the people in three specific areas. These are the three things they were educated in. What would be the obvious first thing they were educated in? Academics, yeah, academics. So they educated the people of these third world countries academically, basically teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic. Okay? Now we have the four cores, you know, math, science, English, social studies. Those days it was reading, writing, and arithmetic. Okay? So that's what they taught them, was academics. What else might they teach them about? What? No, not so much religion.
History.
No? What'd you say? How? These people weren't, you have to have a semester just to graduate here, because we like health education and hygiene. These people were not up to date. So another thing they taught them was about health education, eating right, living right, hygiene, showering on occasion, taking care of your teeth, you know, those types of things. Okay, so they educated the people in the country in health, education, and hygiene. And then what else would they teach them how to do in a third world country to make a living?
Trees.
What type of field would they educate them in?
Farming.
Farming, agriculture. So the third thing they taught these third world countries, they educated them on agricultural matters, how to farm, how to grow crops, how to make money doing that, those types of things. So when it first started, they educated the people of the country academically, they educated the people of the country in health education and hygiene, and they also educated the people of the country on agricultural matters, such as farming, growing crops, those types of things. Being able to be self-sufficient to feed themselves and maybe make a little bit of money. Now, by the end of 1963, there were 11,000 Peace Corps volunteers serving in 40 different countries. So he started that on March 1st of 1961, and in less than 3 years, there were 11,000 Peace Corps volunteers serving in 40 countries. So because of that success, Congress made it a permanent organization, and it still exists today with similar philosophies of third world countries. You know who the people that are volunteer nowadays are, though?
Older people.
People like myself that retire and need something to do, and so they volunteer to go to the Peace Corps. So when it started as youths, now it has evolved 50, 60 years later, is older people retired are the big majority of people in the Peace Corps now. Okay, but it was a very popular program that was started and still exists today. Okay, let's talk about that Bay of Pigs affair that got Alan W. Dulles fired. Okay, we'll start this today, probably won't get through it, but this was a big deal because it's Kennedy's first attempt at foreign affairs. And it does not go real well, and those people that said, yeah, this guy is pretty young and inexperienced, really used this against him. And he never redeemed himself fully until what happened? Cuban Missile Crisis, okay? So this is Kennedy's first shot at foreign affairs. Now, the biggest concern, you don't have to even write this down, the biggest concern Kennedy had when he took office was American morale toward what? Communism, Soviet Union. We were concerned about our morale. And President Kennedy wanted to take some sort of quick, bold action to help Americans regain their self-confidence. They're kicking our butt in the race for space. Their kids are smarter than ours, supposedly. We have a kind of a self-esteem problem when it comes to communism. Are they better than we are? You know, are we a lesser? And so Kennedy wanted to take some bold, quick action to restore American confidence that we were better than the Russians. Well, in the little island of Cuba, just 90 miles from Key West, Florida, we had a communist leader by the name of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro. And he became a very strong ally with the Soviet Union. And the people that lived in Cuba were living under communist rule 90 miles from the United States of America. And Kennedy didn't like that. Now, this didn't start with Kennedy. The United States wanted to free Cuba from Castro's control way back in the 50s when Eisenhower was president. It was a concern. So it's not like Kennedy took off and said, oh my God, Cuba's down there with a communist leader. Eisenhower was very concerned about it as well. So in the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration really had already initiated a plan on how to deal with Castro, how to get him out of there and let these people be non-communist. And this plan never came to action because it happened late in Eisenhower's administration. So the plan is going to be something that Kennedy's going to inherit and look at and decide whether he thinks it's a good idea or not. Okay? So this original plan to deal with Fidel Castro in Cuba happened in the late 1950s during the Eisenhower administration. He didn't stay in office long enough for it to be initiated, and so it'll be Kennedy's choice. Now, here was the plan. There was going to be an invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles. And these Cuban exiles had already, before Kennedy took office, been trained by the CIA for this invasion. What are exiles? People got kicked out of the country. So these people, who better to revolt against Castro than people that he exiled or kicked out of the country that have ended up where? In the United States. So the CIA came up with this plan during the Eisenhower administration. Here's what we'll do. We'll train these guys militarily, and they will invade Cuba, so we can kind of wash our hands of it, because it'll then be a revolution, right? Citizens revolting. So that was kind of the plan, okay? The original plan consisted of an invasion of Cuba, not by United States military, but by Cuban exiles that were trained by the CIA. Now, here's what this invasion of Cuba by these exiles was supposed to accomplish. This is what was supposed to happen. Now, we're assuming, the United States, that those people in Cuba don't like being under communist rule, right? Or we wouldn't even be thinking about this. So, this is the first thing that this invasion of Cuba was supposed to accomplish. One, it would trigger an anti-communist attitude within Cuba by the people living there, right? So when they invaded Cuba, it would trigger this anti-communist attitude. These people that didn't like being under Fidel Castro would all of a sudden be anti-communist, which would lead to, number two, a revolt by those Cuban citizens who were tired of Castro's dictatorship. So again, this invasion of Cuba by exiles would trigger an anti-communist attitude within Cuba, which would lead to a revolt by these Cuban citizens living in Cuba who were tired of Castro's dictatorship, which would lead to the assassination of Fidel Castro. So that was the goal of this invasion that was set up during the Eisenhower administration. Is when they invaded Cuba, it would trigger an anti-communist attitude, which would lead to a revolt by Cuban citizens that were tired of Castro's dictatorship, which would lead to the assassination of Fidel Castro and the democratic government taking over, right? This is a plan. So President Kennedy inherits this plan, and it will be his decision whether he will use the plan or not. Okay? Now keep in mind, what's he looking for? Some quick, bold action to regain American confidence against the Soviets. So President studies Eisenhower's plan. And who does he talk to specifically? Because he wants to know exactly what the American commitment's going to be. I mean, I get this, folks. He says to the CIA, this is going to be exiles we train, but in the end, what is my commitment going to be? What am I going to have to put my name on? Okay? Who would he? What organization would he ask that? The CIA, right? So he gets with the CIA, led by who? Alan W. Dulles, and he says, okay, I get the plan, I understand it, but what is the American commitment going to be? What do I have to kind of sign my name to and take responsibility for? This is what the CIA informed Kennedy that they would need from him concerning this invasion. This is what they wanted from Kennedy. When these exiles hit the beaches of Cuba, they're going to be vulnerable, right? So what does the CIA want Kennedy to do? Provide what? Air support. Or could be cover fire. Air support. So the first thing that the CIA says to President Kennedy, well listen, one thing we are going to need is when these exiles hit the beach, we're going to need some air support in case they meet resistance, which they more than likely would, right? Okay? So we got to give us some air support when we go in. The second thing we need is after this anti-communist attitude and after this revolt by the Cuban citizens and after this assassination of Fidel Castro, we're going to need American troops to go in afterwards and kind of mop up, okay, clean things up and get things organized. After the invasion, after the anti-communist attitude, after the revolt by the Cuban citizens tired of Castro's rule, and after the assassination of Fidel Castro, President Kennedy, we need you to send in some troops just to mop up. Because they're going to do all the dirty work. You just need to go in and kind of clean her up. Okay? And the third thing we're going to need from you is once that happens, we'd like the American government to assist the Cubans in establishing what? A democratic government. So Kennedy goes to the CIA and he says, now what I got to sign my name to? Well, listen, Mr. President, we're going to need air support for those exiles when they hit the beach. Then you just sit back and watch because they'll have this anti-communist attitude. There'll be a revolt among the citizens. They will overthrow the Cuban government and assassinate Castro. Once that happens, we need you to go in and kind of mop up with troops and restore peace and get things under control, and then please help us put a democratic government in Cuba. Okay? So Kennedy listens to that, okay? And he thinks about it, and he studies and consults with his cabinet, and Lawrence O'Brien, and David Powers, and Kenneth O'Donnell, and his brother, and he decides to go ahead and give the permission to go ahead with Eisenhower's plan and put it into action. Okay, so he gives the go-ahead. He studies it up, he consults with his advisors, and he finally makes the decision to continue Eisenhower's plan. So, on April 17th of 1961, April 17th of 1961, a force of 1,382 Cuban exiles landed on the southern coast of Cuba. On April 17, 1961, a force of 1,382 Cuban exiles landed on the southern coast of Cuba. You know what the name of the place they landed was?
Bay of Pigs.
The Bay of Pigs. It was a bay in Cuba, in Havana Harbor. So on April 17, 1961, a force of 1,382 Cuban exiles landed on the southern coast of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. And we'll tell you tomorrow what happened.